Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with John Wick, who is the creative director of 7th Sea, and we talked about the best villains in all of TTRPGs. As you can tell from the title of the video, Dracula comes up, and our conversation branches into a discussion of villains in fiction generally, and specifically of how interesting and nuanced Dracula is as a villain. I'll jump across to that interview in just a moment, but first, I want to say thank you to everybody for subscribing to the channel. We've just passed the 10,000 subscriber milestone, and that's incredibly cool. All of us at Chaosium are really grateful for your support. And with that, let's jump across to the interview. Thanks for watching.
Well, a great reoccurring villain is a villain with a plan. A villain who has a long-term goal. And since you brought this topic up to me, I've been thinking about an example of a villain that I could use that's common enough that everybody would immediately know who I'm talking about. And as it turns out, I've been thinking a lot about Dracula recently. And Dracula has a long-term plan. He's moving from Transylvania to London, and he wants to move into a new society. And he has placed all over the city these coffins filled with his native soil so that he has places that he can hide out and he can travel around and all that kind of stuff. And of course, he also has a romantic long-term goal. Well, it's romantic in some movies and not so romantic in others. But it's also is that he wants to make more vampires. And so the using Dracula as an example of a villain who has a long-term goal, has plots that are already in place before the players are even aware who the villain is. Because if you think of Jonathan Harker and Quincy and all the rest of them, they don't know that Dracula is a villain. It's not until Van Helsing shows up later in the story and goes, "Oh no, this is a vampire." And then and then the players go, "Oh, this guy that we've been inviting into our houses is a villain." And he's already laid roots. His plan is already on the way. It's already going. And so I think that, using Dracula that way is a really good example that's immediately recognizable.
Dracula is an interesting answer, and it's also not one I would have necessarily suspected. I think there's been a lot of versions of Dracula over the years, and some have been better than others. Is there a particular style or approach? Because I think there's some versions of Dracula that have been relatively bland.
Well, Dracula, one of the things about Dracula in the later works that make him a really interesting villain, because at first, honestly, he's kind of a racist villain, and that he's the foreign menace who is coming to steal our women, right? I've been talking to a local theater producer, and I was like, I want to do the Dracula play and invert all the genders. All the genders. So it's the Countess Dracula who is showing up to Britain to steal all of the men. So Wilhelmina Harker becomes William Harker and all that kind of stuff. And that changes the dynamic of the play and of the story. Later on, Dracula becomes more interesting when they make him more romantic. He's more of a tragic Byron-esque figure. And he's already a Byron-esque figure to begin with, but they just went straight to 11. They put the gas down and they went straight to 11. Let's make him sexy with right around, although there had been erotic vampire fiction before that, the first real big cultural push in that direction, I think, and I could be wrong about this, I'm not an expert, is Frank Langella's Dracula, who was attractive and charming and sexy and erotic and kind of forbidden and all that kind of stuff. And so that's what makes him interesting. And the problem with having an uninteresting villain or an unsympathetic villain is that, well, let's just call the cops on him. Done. There is no moral dilemma. There's no moral quandary about dealing with the villain. If the villain is just straight up evil, then okay, I have no problem dealing with this villain. But if you have a villain like the villain in Black Panther, who all the way through the film is going, where was Wakanda? Where was Wakanda in the Civil War? Where was Wakanda in the race riots? Where was Wakanda? You know, that whole thing. He's got a point, and he's hard to ignore, and he's difficult to dismiss because he's right. And so uninteresting villains or boring villains are just, I mean, they're just hit point bags just waiting to be hit. But villains who are not, who have a point or have a motivation that you sympathize with are much more interesting.
Do you think that there is something unique about Dracula in terms of the lore and story around him? Like, you know, he's a vampire. He's, you said, you know, he's kind of a representation of the other, maybe.
Yeah.
That makes him such a good villain, or is it just an effective use of tropes that can be applied to anything?
I think that Dracula as the archetypal vampire, like Bram Stoker hit on something. He touched a real nerve. And I think that what makes him such a great villain is that he has all of the tropes that make a villain interesting. Even if in the first book, in Bram Stoker's book, he's not a very sympathetic character. At least he's not written as a sympathetic character. But there's like that underlying mythological stuff underneath it that carries all of the subtext. If you read the book, if you read the book and you see, and other people have, I'm not new on this, right? But if you read the book and you start reading this, it's really easy to read the subtext of making him a demon lover, or making him a tragic figure, or making him, you know, all these different things that you can sympathize with. And so subsequent vampires have followed that model and then gone in different directions with it, including like the Nosferatu, the German film. Clearly not a romantic character, but also clearly a very tragic character. And then you go into the different iterations of Dracula. My personal favorite is the Langella Dracula, because that's the one I saw when I was 10, right? And so that's where I got all of that stuff. But I think that vampires in general just have so many potent tropes attached to them that they make them intriguing to most people. There are people, like a few people who live in this house with me, who would go, no, that is not intriguing to me at all. That is a super abusive, selfish person that I want nothing to do with. So again, it's something that, you know, does Dracula work as a really great villain? Yes, but know your audience.
So let me ask you this. What are some of the worst depictions of Dracula that we've gotten over the years?
I think the ones that really do de-emphasize the empathy with the character. I think Dracula works as a villain, like all villains, when you feel a desire to root for him. Like, even if it's one of the templates for Dracula, for example, is Angel from the Buffy TV show. He is clearly a Dracula analog. He's a romantic figure who's under a curse, who, you know, and if the curse goes off, it turns into something really bad, which is a metaphor for something else that's really kind of scary, right? And the fact that even though he is incredibly dangerous and he is, you know, a monster, he is trying not to be and wants to be better, even though his nature is driving him to be evil. And I think Angel is a really good example of the Dracula archetype done in such a way that makes him a great villain, because and then when the curse does manifest himself, he is just evil. And that evilness, you see that evil character walking around, and in your head you're going, you used to be cool. You used to be cool. You used to be so cool, and I had such a crush on you, and now you're evil, right? And I think that dichotomy is what makes a Dracula or a Dracula really, really fun.
Are you sure? And this is a pretty detailed theory, so you might be able to elaborate on it. But are you sure you don't just like Angel and Dracula because they both have wings?
You might be right. You might be right. It's the flying thing. I got a thing for the flying thing. It has nothing to do with the a lover who might destroy me. It's got nothing to do with that at all.
Let me ask you a comparison question then. If we're talking about the greatest villains in fiction, there's a whole pool to draw from, but one that I hear quoted a lot is Vader. And I think that Vader, at least within the context of the original trilogy, doesn't necessarily have that lover aspect. There's a paternal element. It's quite different. Do you see similarities between Dracula and Vader, or is this sort of a completely different pathway to get to an interesting villain?
Well, I'm not going to say that Vader is not seen by some as a romantic villain, because he certainly can be, right? He certainly started that way. He wasn't a villain like at the beginning, but his whole thing is built on heartbreak, right? And so he's the, no more love, ever again. And I guarantee you there is a ton of slash fiction out there with with Vader and someone who knows who it is. But at the same time, I really like you talking about Darth Vader, because he really fits the archetype of a great villain with a long-term plan and goals to achieve that plan, and a really conflicted morality. I think villains that have conflicted morality are much more interesting than villains with I know exactly what I'm doing and I'm always right. It's one of the reasons that Walter White in Breaking Bad is a brilliant villain, even though he starts off as the protagonist and ends up as the antagonist in a lot of ways. I think villains that have conflicted morality, that are fighting with their morality, which is shown in the movies when Luke appeals to him and says, hey, you don't have to do this. And in a brief moment, he goes, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. And that's tough. That's a great moment. And also, Luke doesn't give up on him, because that conflict is always there. He even denies it. There is no conflict. It's like, clearly there is, pal, if you have to deny it that hard. But I think that one of the things that make villains the most interesting to me is that conflicted morality, that a hero can go to them and go, hey, buddy, here's my hand. And that's the moment we all want. And as a storyteller, if you have a villain with a conflicted morality and you have a character who can, help heal them, then your players or your readers or whatever are going to be begging for those two to have a scene, right? And that's a really cool thing. And in the 7th Sea, there actually is a mechanic for that, for turning villains into heroes. And so, I mean, because of course, why wouldn't you have that in a game with, swashbuckling adventure, right?
I'd like to do a quick rapid fire round where I hit you with a few villains and I want to get your impressions of them. Is this something that you think is done well? What do you think is done well about them? Does that sound okay?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start off with Sauron. Not a moral conflict there, at least not.
No. Well, he's boring too, because he's a big eye. And sure, I could read the Silmarillion and find out more about him, but no.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's do Thanos. Not necessarily moral conflict, but a very strong long-term plan.
Indeed, and has a moral conflict to a certain degree, although he's pretty set on his ways. The thing about Thanos that makes him interesting is that he believes he is doing the right thing. And that's what makes Thanos that one more degree interesting than most archetypal villains.
This is a bit of a wider scope one, but what about the many villains of the Cthulhu mythos? These are creatures that have a long-term plan that is not understandable to humanity. Does that mean that effectively they have none? And they definitely don't have any moral quandaries because their morals are also ununderstandable to us.
So for Cthulhu, for the mythos, the inhuman entities of the mythos, which are beyond our understanding and everything like that, I mean, that's not what they're there for. They're there to remind you that the universe is really, really big and you're really, really small, and the universe probably doesn't even know that you're here. The interesting character in the mythos is Nyarlathotep, who is a trickster god, essentially, right? Who likes screwing with humanity and finds delight in humanity. And well, at least my Nyarlathotep takes a kind of delight in humanity. And there have been times in my Cthulhu campaigns that I run where he actually saves humanity. He stops something from happening. And it's not because he likes us. It's because he's amused by us. And he wants us around a little bit longer. And that kind of distinction is fun to play with.
Well, let's look back to 7th Sea for a second. 7th Sea has this fantastic and detailed world that is built up with all these amazing characters. You can go through each of the homelands and you can find are they ruled by a hero? Are they ruled by a villain? There's all kinds of stuff you can dive into. Who do you think is your favorite villain amongst all of the canonical villains within the books of 7th Sea?
Of all the villains, there's a lot of them. But I really love like the organization of the Adabating Trading Company as a villain, because it is a megacorp. It's something that a modern audience can understand. A big fan of those. However, and this is going to be totally predictable and cliche for people who understand the 7th Sea. But the Vidace merchant noble Villanova is fascinating to me because he is so evil, just diabolically evil. But he's also sophisticated and is bored by mundane things and is constantly looking for things to challenge him because he's bored. And so because of that, he will instead of killing heroes when he gets them, he will let them go. Because otherwise, who am I going to play with?
Let me ask you then a little bit of a tough question. When you look at the broad scope of 7th Sea stuff out there, because there's been an enormous amount over several editions, is there a villain that you wish you could have spent a little more time with to get them to land just a bit better?
Yeah, there's the main inquisitor of the Inquisition of the Vatican Church. I think that he needs, like, for me, he's just too, right now, the way that he's portrayed is that he's just too evil. He's just too, like, I am evil, ha ha ha. I was like, it's boring. I think if I took another swing at it, I would give him many, many reasons why he has come to the place that he's come. And again, that gives the heroes an opportunity to better understand the villain and defeat the villain, or like heal them. At least, give them the opportunity before they slip off the wall and plummet to their doom. The opportunity to, say or do something right? And I think that's I think that would be more interesting.
As a final question for you, I'd like you to look outside of 7th Sea and your own work, outside of Chaosium, into the wider world of TTRPG specifically, all of the other books and settings and stories that are out there. What is an amazing villain that you think has been done in one of the wider TTRPG industry works?
So in I want to say Torg, but it would take me 10 minutes to explain Torg before I got to the character.
I thought, I mean, the classic one would be for you to say Strahd because it's a lot of tied to Dracula, right?
Yeah,
But
I mean, Strahd is Dracula, right? I mean, he has all of the tropes of Dracula, and that's why he's such an interesting villain, and that's why he's almost archetypal. But to me, actually, a villain that I really like because almost nothing has been said about him that I know of. Like there have been stuff written about him, but from what I know, there's been almost nothing written about Vecna. And with from D&D, the Hand and Eye of Vecna. And so when I got my Dungeon Master's Guide and the Hand and Eye of Vecna are in there, and they talk about the Sword of Kos, the sword that cut off his hand and cut out his eye and all that. I mean, I'm a big fan of Vecna only because I know that Gary stole it from Michael Moorcock. He stole it from Michael Moorcock's Quorum. But still, there was nothing written about him except that he was a really powerful lich, that his bodyguard Kos had cut off his hand and cut out his eye and all that kind of stuff. And that was it. That was the only thing that we knew, which meant that you could take Vecna and I could take Vecna and add that character to our D&D campaigns, and they'd be entirely different. And to me, that is one of the great features of role-playing games. People come to me all the time and they're like, oh, John, we changed L5R to do this. And I went, great. And they're like, oh, really? We thought you'd be really upset. I'm like, no. I think it's a feature that your Vecna, my 7th Sea, your 7th Sea, my Nyarlathotep and your Nyarlathotep can be entirely different. And because then they become like mythological cultural heroes who have all these different stories. It's like your Lancelot is different from my Lancelot, even though we just live across the river from each other, right? And I think that that's a really neat feature of role-playing games that makes them unique among literature.